Before the city had a name, before the tower became a warning, there was a plain at daybreak and a rising frame of brick dark with bitumen. Men were already climbing. Baskets swung from shoulders. Orders moved through the morning air in one shared tongue. Somewhere below, kiln fires were still burning from the night. Somewhere above, an unfinished height cut against the pale sky. And beneath all that work lay a question that the builders may not have spoken aloud. If the world had once been washed clean by judgment, what kind of world would human beings make the second time? Genesis tells the story with remarkable brevity. A few verses, a plain in Shinar, one language, a city, a tower with its top in the heavens, a people determined to make a name for themselves and not be scattered over the earth. Then the Lord comes down, confuses their speech, and the whole project collapses into misunderstanding. The story is short enough to memorize, but it has never remained small. It reaches into memory, empire, language, worship, fear, and ambition. It asks why human beings gather, what they think will save them, and what happens when unity is bent away from obedience and turned towards self-exaltation. The plain of Shinar points us towards southern Mesopotamia, the broad alluvial land watered by the Tigris and Euphrates. This was a world of mud reeds, canals, floodplains, and heat. Stone was scarce, timber was limited. But clay was everywhere. Fired brick was not just a building material, it was power. It meant permanence in a place where rain and flood could undo what hands had made. It meant planning, labor, fuel, measurement, hierarchy. It meant a people who had learned how to reshape the earth beneath their feet and harden it into walls, platforms, gateways, and towers. That detail matters because the Bible pauses to mention it. They made bricks and baked them thoroughly. They used tar for mortar. The text is not merely telling us how they built. It is showing us that these were not wandering survivors living from day to day under the shadow of the flood. They were organized, skilled, confident. They had discovered what human cooperation could do when directed toward one visible purpose. The danger in Babel is not ignorance. It is talent without humility. The old world before the flood had ended in violence. The new world begins with a command: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. That command is not random. It is part of how life is meant to unfold under God's blessing. Spread out. Carry life into the wide world. Do not turn the human family into one clenched fist. But on the plain of Shinar, another instinct begins to rise. Stay together, build upward. Secure the future with walls, systems, and a monument large enough to hold a frightened human race in one place. That fear is easy to miss because the builders sound bold. Yet they say plainly why they are building. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Their ambition is not only pride, it is also resistance born from anxiety. The earth is wide. Distance means uncertainty. Dispersion means loss of control. To settle is natural. To build is human. But to build in order to refuse sheep God has given the world is something else. Babel is not simply a story about architecture. It is about a settled act of the will. Later readers often imagine one tyrant standing at the center of the whole enterprise. And the name that usually appears is Nimrod. The Bible does connect Babel to Nimrod's kingdom in Genesis 10. It calls him a mighty man, a mighty hunter before the Lord, and places Babel among the first centers of his rule in Shinar. But Genesis 11 does not actually name him as the tower's builder. That link belongs more to later interpretation than to the wording of the text itself. Even so, the connection is not hard to understand. The rise of cities, concentrated power, and early kingship hangs close to this story. Whether Nimrod was present in the scene or not, Babel belongs to the same world. A world where power is beginning to gather itself into cities and names. So the story opens not with primitive confusion, but with disciplined cooperation. It opens with a people who can speak to one another, organize one another, and imagine a common future. That is why the story has bite. Human beings are not condemned here for creativity, labor, or even civic life in themselves. The tragedy of Babel is that the very gifts that could serve life are turned into instruments of refusal. Brick by brick, a city rises, and brick by brick, something in the human heart reveals itself again. After the waters to understand Babel, we have to feel the world that comes before it. The flood is not a distant preface in Genesis. It is the great wound behind the story. Noah and his family emerge into a cleansed but fragile earth carrying memory that no later generation can fully escape. They know what judgment looks like. They know what violence can bring. They know that the world is both gift and danger. The covenant with Noah places a bow in the clouds and gives a promise that the waters will not again destroy all flesh. Yet promise does not erase human nature. It only reveals with fresh mercy what human beings will do next. Genesis moves quickly after the flood into the table of nations in chapter 10. It names peoples, clans, territories, and languages, showing the world already spread and varied. Then chapter 11 steps back and tells the Babel story that explains how such dispersal came to be. This is one of the Bible's quiet literary habits. It gives the result, then returns to explain the turning point. So Babel stands as a hinge in early human history. It is not only about one city, it is about how the many came to be many. The memory of shared origin runs through the whole account. These are not strangers from opposite ends of the world. They are one human family, one speech, one stock, one recent history. That matters because division is more painful when it happens among those who once moved together. Babel is not the collision of separate civilizations. It is the breaking apart of a common house. In that sense, the story contains a kind of sorrow even before the judgment falls. The unity of the human race is real, and the Bible does not treat that unity as trivial. There is something powerful, even beautiful, in a people able to understand one another. Shared speech means shared thought, shared memory, shared planning. It makes cooperation possible at a scale that can transform the landscape. Anyone who has seen a city rise from labor knows there is wonder in this. Human beings are makers. They bind communities together. They pass skill from hand to hand. A kiln, a mold, a wall line scratched into the dirt, a foreman's call, a child carrying water, elders deciding where the gate should stand. This too is part of being human. But the Bible will not let us romanticize unity by itself. Unity can serve worship, justice, and peace. It can also serve vanity, domination, and revolt. The question is never only whether people are united. The question is what their unity is for. Babel is the first great biblical warning that collective strength can become morally blind when it no longer receives its purpose from beyond itself. That warning fits the wider world of early Mesopotamia. The southern river plain rewarded cooperation. Canals had to be cut and maintained. Floodwaters had to be managed. Fields had to be organized. Temples, storehouses, walls, and raised platforms required labor far beyond what one household could provide. Cities in such a landscape were achievements of coordination. They depended on calendars, quotas, transport, skill, and authority. A ruler or priestly class could draw scattered effort into one visible form. In that environment, the line between civilization and control was thin. This is why Babel matters as more than a morality tale. It belongs to the history of urban concentration, sacred architecture, and political ambition. The world after the flood does not simply drift into sin through private acts. It begins to structure rebellion. It gives it a skyline. It bakes it into brick. That is a more sobering thought than simple lawlessness. Disorder can be frightening, but organized pride may be more dangerous because it looks so efficient while it rises. Still, the builders of Babel were not thinking in abstract terms. They were facing practical realities. Open land invites movement, but it also exposes weakness. Dispersion means vulnerability. Families split. Resources thin out. Memory fades. The flood itself may have deepened the instinct to stay together in one secure place beneath one order, under one recognizable center. Fear often dresses itself as prudent. A tower can look like wisdom when the horizon feels uncertain. And yet the text keeps the issue clear. God had told humanity to fill the earth. The builders say they do not want to be scattered. That is the center of the conflict. Babel is not a misunderstanding. It is a counter-movement. The city is meant to anchor humanity against a divine command that would send them outward. The tower is not only construction, it is declaration. One speech when Genesis says the whole earth had one language and the same words, it gives the story a strange clarity. There are no translation problems at start, no diplomatic barriers, no confusion of terms. Language in Babel is not failing. It is functioning almost perfectly. That makes what follows more unsettling, because human beings do not need misunderstanding in order to rebel. They can agree with one another completely and still be wrong together. Speech does more than pass information. It shapes belonging. It lets a people tell the same stories, mark the same boundaries, laugh at the same jokes, repeat the same commands, and remember the same dead. To share language is to live inside one verbal world. Babel begins with that kind of closeness. Everyone hears the same call and knows what it means. Come, let us make bricks. Come, let us build a city. Come, let us make a name. The repeated invitation is part of the power of the scene. Human beings summon one another into a common purpose, and each summons gathers force from the last. There is an echo here that many readers notice. Earlier in Genesis, God speaks, and the world comes into being. Later, God will say, "Let us make man in our image." In Babel, humanity begins to answer divine creative speech with its own collective "let us." That does not mean building is evil. It means the human project is starting to imitate sovereignty. People who ought to receive limits now speak as though they can establish their own horizon and secure their own identity by shared effort alone. The phrase "make a name for ourselves" deserves careful attention. In the ancient world, a name meant more than reputation. It was memory, standing, continuity, legacy. To have a name was to remain present in the minds of others after death, to take a place in the human order that could not be easily erased. Kings built inscriptions for that reason. Cities raised gates for that reason. Temples and towers were not only useful structures, they were claims against oblivion. That longing is deeply human. Mortality presses on every generation. We want our labor to outlast us. We want to be remembered. We want to believe that our work is not smoke in the wind. Babel becomes dangerous not because people desire significance, but because they decide to manufacture significance apart from obedience. They will not receive a name, they will make one. Later in Scripture, God will tell Abram, freshly called out of the same broad region, "I will make your name great." The contrast is quiet but sharp. Babel grasps, faith receives. Shared speech also makes shared delusion possible. A people can repeat an idea until it sounds inevitable. We know this from every age. If enough voices say that security depends on centralization, that greatness depends on height, that survival depends on one system, one city, one monument, then dissent begins to sound like treason or madness. The same language that builds trust can also close the imagination. No one needs to ask whether they should build. The chorus has already answered. In Mesopotamian culture, height carried sacred meaning. Temple towers, later called ziggurats, rose as stepped structures above the plain, often with a shrine at the summit, or a symbolic link between earth and the divine world. The biblical Tower of Babel is often associated with that kind of architecture, and the connection is historically plausible, though the text itself does not use the later technical word. What matters is that the builders are not merely trying to create a tall structure for shelter or defense. They want a tower with its top in the heavens. In biblical language, that can be an idiom for extreme height, but it also touches the ancient desire to mark sacred access, to establish a visible center where heaven and earth are somehow joined. That possibility makes Babel even more subtle. The project may not have looked irreligious to its builders. Ancient cities were full of worship. Tower building could easily be clothed in sacred language. Human pride often survives best when it borrows religious form. A city can claim piety while making itself the final object of trust. A tower can gesture toward heaven while denying the God of heaven. That is one reason Babel has endured as a symbol. It names not only open rebellion, but sanctified self-importance. There is also irony in the Hebrew name Babel itself. In Babylonian, the old form of the name could mean something like Gate of God. In Genesis, the story turns the sound toward another Hebrew word, Balal, to confuse or mix. The place that imagined itself a gate to heaven becomes the site of broken speech. Human beings often name their projects according to glory. God reveals them according to truth, so the one language of Babel is both gift and danger. It allows a whole people to move with one mind. But when the mind is bent against God, the gift becomes a weapon. What is frightening in the story is not only the tower, it is the unanimity beneath the tower. No friction, no hesitation, no voice saying the command after the flood still matters. No voice asking whether a city built to prevent scattering might itself be an act of distrust. Or, if such voices were present, they were drowned out by the sound of everyone else agreeing. Let us build the city matters as much as the tower. In popular memory, Babel is often reduced to one extraordinary structure, as though the Bible were mainly concerned with a failed ancient skyscraper. But let us build ourselves a city and a tower. The tower rises out of an urban project. It belongs to a system of settlement, control, and identity. A city gathers population, labor, worship, storage, law, and defense. A tower gives the city its visible center and its statement of purpose. That purpose is made explicit. We do not want to be scattered. The city is a machine against dispersion. It will hold the people together by force of structure and spectacle. The tower will be the sign that binds them. This is what makes the whole enterprise more than vanity. It is a political theology. The city is not merely where people happen to live. It becomes the answer to a command they do not want to obey. Think of the practical labor involved. Clay had to be dug, mixed, shaped, dried or fired, stacked, and transported. Bitumen had to be collected and heated. Kilns had to be fed. Work crews had to be assigned. Measurements had to be repeated accurately. The walls of the city could not rise by enthusiasm alone. They required disciplined routine. The same is true of any civilization. Pride rarely builds anything without patience. It often looks industrious because it is. This is one reason Babel resists simple readings. The builders are not lazy, irrational, or obviously monstrous. They are competent. They cooperate. They innovate. They may even believe they are protecting the future of their children. Human rebellion is often most persuasive when it attaches itself to things that are genuinely admirable in themselves. Organization is good. Skill is good. Shared labor is good. The biblical drama comes from the fact that good capacities are serving a disordered center. In the river plains of Mesopotamia, cities had reasons to rise where they did. Waterways supported trade. Irrigation supported agriculture. Temples helped order civic life. Urban life concentrated expertise and gave shape to power. Over time, cities could become symbols of stability in a dangerous world. To step beyond the city was to enter uncertainty. To remain within it was to inhabit a managed reality. Babel seems to gather that instinct into one early act of collective settlement. Here we will remain. Here we will secure ourselves. Here we will write our future in baked clay. The tower intensifies the meaning. In a land with little stone, a great brick tower was a declaration of mastery over environment. It said the plain itself could be transformed into ascent. Mud could be turned into permanence. Earth could be arranged into a vertical claim. Every ascending level would have announced that human beings were not simply surviving after the flood. They were asserting themselves. And yet the text never says they could actually reach God. It does not portray heaven as vulnerable to siege. The problem is not that humanity almost built too high. The problem is the heart declared by the building. They seek heavenward symbolism without submission. They seek greatness without reference to the giver of greatness. They seek security on their own terms. Babel is absurd and serious at once. It is absurd because no tower can force access to the divine. It is serious because the desire behind it is real and recurring. Later Jewish and Christian traditions sometimes imagine the tower as a direct attempt to storm heaven or escape another flood. Those ideas capture parts of the human mood, but they go beyond what Genesis clearly states. The text itself is more restrained and therefore more penetrating. It gives us the builder's own words: make a name, avoid scattering. That is enough. Pride does not need fantasy weapons to become rebellion. It only needs a project that removes dependence on God from the center of human life. There is another important feature in the story. The builders say, "Let us build ourselves a city." The repetition of ourselves matters. The city is for self-definition. It is not a response of gratitude. It is not framed as stewardship. It is self-securing, self-naming, self-exalting. In that sense, Babel is the architectural form of the human heart after Eden. The same old impulse returns in a new shape. In Eden, the temptation was to grasp wisdom and godlikeness apart from trust. On the plane of Shinar, the temptation becomes collective. We will establish ourselves. We will rise by our own design. We will not accept the limits placed on us. The city therefore becomes a mirror of civilization's double edge. Human beings are meant to make culture. They plant, build, sing, govern, name, and remember. Scripture does not despise this calling. But every human culture asks, in one way or another, who stands at the center? If the answer becomes the human project itself, then even the strongest walls cannot save what is being built. That is Babel's warning. A city may stand against wind and flood for a season. It cannot stand forever against the truth of its own foundation. A name in Bricket is easy to speak about pride in general terms and miss its texture. In Babel, pride is not loud vanity alone. It is the wish to settle history on human terms. It is the refusal to live as creatures under a command. It is the belief that unity, technology, and concentrated will can achieve what trust and obedience would require us to receive instead. The line "make a name for ourselves" exposes that motive, but it does not exhaust it. The tower is also a public sign of permanence. In the ancient Near East, cities anchored memory. Temples tied a people to a god, a ruler to a divine order, a region to a center of gravity. A monumental structure could say to every traveler and every child born within its walls, "This is who we are. This is where meaning lives. This is the center to which you belong." Babel is not merely a worksite. It is an attempt to author a human story without dispersion, without dependence, and in some sense without vulnerability. The flood had shown that human strength could be swept away. Babel answers that memory with consolidation. If danger is out there, gather everyone here. If identity is fragile, make it visible in brick. If future generations may forget, raise something impossible to ignore. That psychology is familiar. People do not always rebel against God because they are drunk on confidence. Sometimes they rebel because they are deeply afraid. Pride and fear often work together. Pride says, "We can secure ourselves." Fear says we must. This makes the story more human and less cartoonish. One can imagine conversations under half-built walls. Mothers thinking about safety. Elders remembering chaos. Leaders arguing that one city will preserve order. Artisans taking pride in what they can now create. Priests or visionaries speaking of a tower linking earth and heaven. Young workers thrilled by belonging to something immense. Few human societies ever describe themselves as rebelling against God. They describe themselves as solving problems, preserving life, honoring greatness, creating legacy. Babel may have felt noble from the inside. That is why biblical discernment matters. The text reaches beneath the surface of the enterprise and shows the contradiction. God had blessed humanity with spread, fruitfulness, and the open earth. Babel redefines blessing as concentration. God had given a world large enough for many peoples. Babel prefers one managed center. God had called human beings to live under his name. Babel wants a human name strong enough to rival obedience. The likely background of Mesopotamian tower culture sharpens the picture. Ziggurats were not defensive fortresses in the modern sense. They were sacred platforms, elevated places set apart within city life. They joined civic power, ritual life, and symbolic geography. A high place in the center of the city could declare both prestige and cosmic order. If Babel belonged to that world of thought, then the tower was not a random vanity project. It was a statement about who mediates meaning in the human world. If heaven and earth meet here, then the city defines the terms. Yet Genesis overturns the whole claim with one subtle phrase: the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. The irony is devastating. The builders speak of a tower in the heavens. The narrator speaks of God stooping to inspect it. What seems immense to human beings is not immense to God. The text does not need mockery. One sentence is enough. Human grandeur is measured from below. Divine judgment sees from above. God's words in the story are also worth hearing carefully. If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. This is not praise of limitless human innocence. It is a sober recognition of what unified humanity can accomplish when shared speech and shared purpose combine. The problem is not ability as such. The problem is ability divorced from moral restraint. Babel reveals how quickly human potential can become expansive rebellion when nothing interrupts it. Some readers stumble here, as though God were threatened by human advancement. But Genesis does not present God as insecure. He is not afraid of tall buildings. He is judging a trajectory. The early chapters of Scripture already know what unchecked human desire becomes. Violence before the flood, self-protective vengeance after Eden, now organized self-exaltation after Noah. The intervention at Babel is therefore not panic. It is boundary. Judgment, yes, but also prevention. And in that sense, there is mercy inside the disruption. A united race in open revolt does not become freer by finishing its tower. It becomes harder to correct. Concentrated arrogance scales faster than scattered pride. The confusion of tongues feels severe because it breaks a human project at its moment of strength. But the story invites us to see that strength itself as the edge of a deeper ruin. Sometimes mercy arrives, not by endorsing momentum, but by shattering it. The Lord came down. The turning point of Babel does not begin with human failure on the scaffolds, or with a storm striking the tower. It begins with divine attention. The Lord came down to see. In biblical storytelling, that language does not mean God needed information in the way human rulers do. It signals intervention. The judge enters the scene. Heaven is not indifferent to what the earth is making. There is both grandeur and intimacy in that moment. The city has gathered thousands of hands, perhaps generations of hope, a landscape shaped by planning and labor. Yet the story narrows to one decisive act of divine evaluation. Human beings can be absorbed in their project and still remain answerable to a reality beyond it. That is one of Scripture's hardest truths for every age. We do not become sovereign by becoming successful. Then comes the divine response. Let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. Again, there is a quiet echo of creation language. Human beings had said, "Let us build." God answers with his own "let us." The final word over history does not belong to the builders. It belongs to the one they tried to build without. How might that confusion have unfolded? Genesis does not describe the mechanics, and wisdom requires restraint where the text is brief. It does not tell us whether the shift was sudden in one instant or spread through the camp in waves. It does not tell us whether families retained common speech while work crews fractured. or whether sound itself seemed to split in every direction at once. The power of the story lies partly in that restraint. We are left to imagine the bewilderment in human terms. A foreman gives an order and sees only blank faces. A laborer reaches for the wrong tool because the word he hears no longer matches the word he knew yesterday. Two brothers shout at each other and discover, to their terror, that they can no longer say the simplest thing. Someone laughs, thinking it is a prank, until panic spreads. Bargains fail, measurements fail, ritual phrases fail, plans fail. The invisible thread that held the whole undertaking together snaps, not in the bricks, but in the mouths of the builders. This is more than inconvenience. Language is woven into identity. To lose mutual comprehension is to lose shared world. Suddenly, the city can no longer function as the builders intended, because the city depended on common speech at every level. Administration collapses, worship collapses, labor collapses, trust collapses. If Babel sought unity as its salvation, then judgment touches the exact point where false salvation lived. There is fittingness in that. The builders used one language to coordinate one rebellion, so language becomes the site of their unraveling. Scripture often portrays judgment in this morally shaped way. Human choices are not punished by arbitrary means alone. They are exposed through the very structures in which they lodged their hope. The city that promised cohesion becomes a place of fracture. The tower that promised a name becomes a ruin attached forever to confusion. And still the story does not linger over spectacle. There is no long destruction scene. No divine fire, no heroic last stand. Construction simply stops. They left off building the city. That may be one of the most haunting lines in the whole account. Great projects can end not only with dramatic collapse, but with abandoned momentum. Tools set down, fires going cold, walls unfinished, ramps empty. The silence after noise can be more severe than visible ruin. The name Babel gathers the lesson. What may once have sounded like Gate of God is remembered through a Hebrew wordplay as confusion. The city wished to interpret itself from below, by its own aspiration. The biblical story interprets it from above, by what God exposed it to be. This is not merely a joke about sound, it is theology. Human beings name according to desire, God names according to truth. There is also something deeply humbling in the way the story handles scale. The builders are fascinated by height. God's action concerns speech. Human beings reach for the spectacular. Divine judgment touches the ordinary medium of daily life. Not the tower's top, but the tongue. Not the skyline, but the sentence. This is consistent with the God of Genesis. He does not need to compete with human display. He can overturn a civilization by touching what it takes for granted. Voices broken open once language fractures, the scattering begins. Genesis is blunt. The Lord scattered them from there, over the face of all the earth. The builders had named scattering as the very future they feared. Judgment gives them the future they resisted. Yet here again the story is doing more than punishing. It is bringing humanity back under the shape of the original command, fill the earth. What rebellion refused, providence will accomplish. Scattering is painful. It means departure, separation, and the end of easy belonging. Families likely divided into clusters based on who could still understand whom. Work crews dissolved into kin groups or emerging language communities. Routes opened outward from Shinar as people searched for land where they could begin again with those whose speech still held. The unfinished city behind them would have remained as a wound and a memory, a place where human certainty broke apart. This movement helps explain why Genesis places the Babel story where it does. The nations of chapter 10 are not an accident of geography alone. They are the outworking of a judgment that is also a redirection. Different peoples, territories, and tongues emerge from this disruption. The world becomes many. That manyness is not presented as evil in itself. Later in Scripture, the nations remain part of God's concern. Diversity of peoples is not the curse. The curse lies in the proud unity that had to be broken. That distinction matters because Babel is sometimes misread as though the existence of many languages were simply a problem to be undone. The story is more subtle than that. What it judges is a unified human project set against God. The multiplication of languages becomes one means by which human power is limited and the earth is filled. Diversity can be burdensome. It can also protect against totalizing pride. A world of many peoples is harder to gather into one rebellion. Of course, dispersion also introduces misunderstanding on a scale the builders did not choose. Trade becomes harder, memory becomes local, diverge, myths multiply, suspicion grows. The human race that once spoke with one mouth now learns how much can be lost in the space between words. In that sense, Babel leaves a mark on history that extends far beyond one generation. It becomes part of the condition of nations. We inherit not only languages, but the fracture of language. And yet not everything at Babel is lost. Human beings still build after Babel. They still form cities, cultivate land, sing, mourn, marry, rule, and worship. God does not erase culture. He disperses it. He does not abolish language. He multiplies it. The judgment restrains centralized rebellion without cancelling the human vocation to make a world. That too is important. Babel is not a rejection of civilization itself. It is a rejection of civilization turned into self-salvation. The emotional force of the scene should not be missed. Imagine those leaving the plane. Children asking why familiar friends no longer speak in familiar sounds. Elders trying to interpret what happened. Leaders stripped of authority because their commands no longer carry. Craftsmen who had dedicated years to the city, now carrying tools away into uncertainty. The road outward must have felt like failure, but sometimes what feels like collapse is the beginning of truer obedience, even if it comes through judgment. There is no sign that the people at Babel repented together before they dispersed. The story is too brief to say. What it does show is that God remains Lord of human history, whether acknowledged or not. Human beings planned one future, God imposed another. That is not a denial of human agency. It is a reminder that agency never becomes ultimate. Babel is one of the Bible's clearest declarations that divine sovereignty can interrupt the strongest collective momentum without strain. The unfinished city also becomes a pattern. Later in Scripture, Babylon will rise as a historical empire, magnificent and oppressive, full of wealth, pride, splendor, and idolatry. The Babel of Genesis is not identical in every detail with the later imperial city, but the echo is deliberate and powerful. Babylon becomes more than a place. It becomes a symbol of organized human arrogance, a civilization that glories in its own height and forgets its limits. The seed planted on the plain of Shinar grows again and again in history. What Babel left behind the story ends quickly, but its meaning keeps widening. Babel leaves behind ruins, roads, languages, and a warning about what human beings do when they try to secure greatness apart from God. It also leaves behind a question that every generation must answer anew. What are we building, and why? For ancient Israel, the story did more than explain linguistic diversity. It placed the surrounding world of Mesopotamian grandeur under judgment from the first pages of Scripture. Great cities were real. Temple towers were real. Kings who made names for themselves were real. But the biblical account refused to be dazzled by them. It measured them against the purposes of God. That was a bold thing to do in a world where massive architecture and centralized power could feel almost divine. The story also guards against romanticizing human unity. We often speak as though togetherness is automatically holy. Babel says otherwise. Unity can become a cover for fear. It can become a tool of coercion. It can magnify folly. A crowd speaking one language may still be running from obedience. What matters is not merely whether people are aligned, but whether their alignment is ordered toward truth, humility, and the good God has named. At the same time, Babel is not permission to celebrate division for its own sake. The fracture of speech is a judgment, not a paradise. Misunderstanding wounds, distance wounds. History after Babel is full of conflict between peoples who cannot easily understand one another. The Bible never treats that pain lightly. It simply refuses to say that the solution lies in a proud return to self-made unity. A healed human community cannot be built on Babel's terms. That is why the story sits so powerfully beside the call of Abram that follows in Genesis 12. After the scattering of nations, God begins a particular history through one man and one family. And to Abram, not to Babel, God gives the promise of a great name. The order matters. Humanity tries to create its own greatness and is scattered. God calls one man in trust and promises blessing for all the families of the earth. In the biblical vision, universal blessing does not come through centralized pride. It comes through divine promise. There is even a later echo in the New Testament that many readers hear without forcing the connection. At Pentecost, people from many nations hear the mighty works of God in their own languages. The miracle does not erase human diversity or collapse the nations into one empire. Instead, it allows understanding across difference under the lordship of God. That is not a simple reversal of Babel, but it is a meaningful contrast. Babel shows unity used against God and broken by judgment. Pentecost shows diverse peoples addressed by God and drawn into worship without losing their tongues. Still, the lasting force of Babel is not found only in later echoes. It remains close because the motives of the builders remain close. Human beings still fear vulnerability. We still gather around visible systems that promise security. We still long for a name that outlives us. We still confuse technical ability with moral rightness. We still imagine that enough coordination, enough speed, enough scale, enough reach can settle the problem of what it means to be human. Babel is ancient, but it is never merely ancient. The story does not ask us to despise cities, language, work, or cultural achievement. It asks us to examine what sits at the heart of them. Are they forms of stewardship, gratitude, and service? Or are they ways of refusing creaturely dependence? Are we filling the earth under blessing, or gathering ourselves into systems that make us feel untouchable? Are we receiving identity, or manufacturing it? Babel does not condemn effort. It exposes self-exaltation, and perhaps that is why the tower had to remain unfinished in memory. A completed monument might have tempted later generations to admire the builders more than to hear the lesson. An unfinished monument forces another kind of reflection. It says human beings can begin much, that they cannot rightly finish. It says the highest thing in sight may still be small before God. It says brilliance without humility does not lead upward forever. It reaches a point where heaven answers. So the plain of Shinar remains in Scripture as more than a location. It is a revealed moment in the story of the human heart. A people who had survived judgment chose control over trust, name over obedience, concentration over calling. God broke their project, not because brick was evil or language was dangerous, but because rebellion had organized itself into a city and called it greatness. In the end, Babel is a profoundly sober story. It neither flatters humanity nor abandons it. Judgment scatters, but it does not end history. Roads spread outward. Nations rise, languages multiply. The world becomes wider than the builders wanted and more governed than they knew. And over all of it, the God who came down at Babel remains the one before whom every tower, every city, every empire, and every name must finally stand.